Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the culminating event of the 2014 Economic History Society Conference, which is, of course, the Tawney Lecture. And this year's Tawney Lecture is Professor Pat Hudson. Pat needs no introduction to the Economic History Society, whose president she was from 2001 to 4. But although she needs no introduction, she very definitely deserves one. Pat was educated as an undergraduate at LSE and then did her PhD at the University of York. And her academic appointments have been at the universities of Leeds, Liverpool, and finally Cardiff, where she's Professor Emeritus, and she's also an Honorary Research Fellow at her alma mater, LSE. During her career, Pat has made a series of diverse and distinguished contributions to economic and social history, blending the analysis of economic, social, and cultural themes, blending also national and regional analysis, and she's also given a lot of attention both to methodology and to issues concerning teaching. Among her major publications are the Genesis of Industrial Capital, a study of the West Riding wool textile industry, 1750 to 1850, Regions and Industries, a perspective on the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the Industrial Revolution, History by Numbers, an introduction to quantitative approaches, and not least the book she assembled for this society in connection with its 75th anniversary, Living Economic and Social History. And in addition to all the interests I've referred to, she also has significant concerns with demography and family life, with economic theory, and also with proto-industrialization. And many of us watched her displaying these interests in virtuoso fashion yesterday afternoon when she presented a paper on the Welsh woolen industry. So however you consider it, Pat Hudson is superbly equipped to address us this afternoon on industrialization, global history, and the ghost of Rostow. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very much indeed for a kind introduction, Rick. I'm very pleased to be invited to give this lecture in Tawney's name. The focus of economic history for Tawney was always the social and moral relationships that underpin economic regimes. In 1913, he wrote, "Too much time is spent today by writers who pile up statistics and facts but never get to the heart of the problem." In his memory, I wish to discuss the heart of the problem in relation to recent histories of British and comparative economic development. I'm going to do this by considering the lasting legacy of Walt Rostow. It's my way into the topic. Also by questioning how we measure economic growth. And finally, by looking at British industrialisation in the light of global history and in an Asian mirror. No one here will need reminding that Rostow was probably the most influential economic historian of the 1960s and 70s on both sides of the Atlantic. His fame rested on an audacious attempt to provide a general model of economic development on a global scale, the Stages of Economic Growth, published in 1960. His reputation came not from general acceptance of his thesis, but on the contrary, in the face of dismissals by leading figures, and case studies of the inapplicability of his model to any concrete example of the process of economic change. Never put a good man down. His work raised questions about the role of the state, capital investment, technology, and leading sectors that gave a focus to subsequent debates. As a challenge to historical materialism, placing emphasis on the autonomous nature of social and political forces, his approach suited very well the Cold War climate in which it was written. A particular attraction, given the Western preoccupation with third world development in the 1960s, was that Rostow provided a recipe for the global spread of democracy and economic growth as an antidote to communism. He subscribed to the then dominant capital fundamentalist interpretation of industrialisation. He thus placed emphasis on the need for state and suprastate involvement to build up social overhead capital and to kickstart the transition to modern economic growth. For several decades, the stages became a shibboleth against which all research and writing on development had to make its way. And of course, it was my bread and butter. Well, it wasn't that palatable as a student. Rostow's model of British industrialisation is endogenous, emphasising the favourable political, social and legal environment, receptiveness to Baconian and Newtonian science, formal and informal institutions of what has since been termed the knowledge economy, and, to quote Rostow, the shift of Puritan ardour from theology to the marketplace. He dated takeoff with crass chronological precision, but he stressed that British supremacy or primacy emerged from centuries of preparation and was no random walk. Though differing fundamentally in details, Rostow agreed with Alexander Gerschenkron that the timing and nature of the process of growth in later industrialisers would be affected by the technological dominance of leaders and reactive nationalisms. He did not, however, dwell long on the inequities created by colonialism or unequal exchange. Rostow's basic premise was that there was generalities and regularities in the development process, a common path, that the West could and should be used as a normative yardstick, and that nurturing the right rationalist culture was vital for the application of science to technology. The end point of Rostow's modernisation narrative was an age of high mass consumption and affluent suburbs, a term he uses often. Along with most of his contemporaries in social science, he assumed that countries would converge eventually around a set of socio-economic and cultural norms and forms consistent with the needs of industrial society. He was not much concerned by the potential environmental implications of this. According to one obituary, Rostow had an almost ghoulish enthusiasm for flip charts detailing body counts during the Vietnam War, which most of you will know he helped to prosecute. But his economic history was not based on analytical statistics. His social science was modelled on biology, not on physics or mechanics. Fast forward half a century from the stages, and Rostow's ghost still stalks the corridors of the academy, well beyond Texas. On the positive side, all studies of industrialisation these days have a global reference and make global comparisons. But reading the history of industrial society backwards, from the seat of its major triumph in the United States, remains central in the Anglophone literature. The West European path to industrialisation via capital-intensive agriculture, labour-saving and energy-intensive industrial technologies remains the general model against which other parts of the globe are evaluated. The idea of a universally desired destination along a common path, the narrative of gradualism, the emphasis on endogenous factors, and the build-up of suitable culture and institutions are all, as everyone in the room knows, at the forefront today, though much debated in their particulars. Western yardsticks continue to be applied. Despite the achievements of the California school, there remains too little use of reciprocal comparisons. In other words, viewing both sides as deviations when seen through the expectations of the other, rather than leaving one as always the norm. The Anglophone literature struggles much more to see strange parallels, surprising resemblances, and efficient adaptations to endowments and global forces than it does to fix upon the long-run cultural and political differences that set the scene for divergence. As with Rostow, the supply side still dominates. This despite the flowering of global histories demonstrating that new consumption and demand impulses and continuous product innovation came from long-distance connections and reciprocal dynamics. There remains relatively little concern about environmental degradation, and the desirability of continuous growth over other goals of development is rarely questioned because it is assumed that these will follow in its wake. Although challenged, the mainstream neoclassical assumptions from the 1950s also endure in the literature. That there's a level playing field for global development, where runners have equal access to the latest technology and aim for the same technological frontier. The assumption of eventual world convergence remains present, in line with equilibrium understandings. As recently as 2000, the Nobel laureate Robert Lucas predicted that the restoration of inter-society income equality will be one of the major economic events of the century to come. In the current historiography, signs of the great divergence between Northwest Europe and Asia are traced back to 1500 or even to medieval times. And the existence of a Malthusian threat in the West is either banished or relegated to the 17th century. In England, the development of the Restoration State and the parliamentary system guarantee a secure environment for physical and intellectual property, facilitate enterprise and discourage rent-seeking. 18th century consumption baskets swell with meat and ale. The working classes experience liberty's dawn, and buoyant real wages create an incentive to substitute capital and coal for labour. With some notable exceptions, less time is spent by economic historians now than in Rostow's day considering the impact of external political and economic forces. Wars, revolutions, financial and trading crises, shifts in the terms of trade, monetary factors are generally treated as temporary shocks or deviations from the long-run equilibrium state. Although they are only part of the story, and an important part, we are preoccupied with the social factors internal to each nation that are seen to contribute to productivity growth, and with the institutional and political obstacles that stand in the way of a seemingly universal drive towards capital and energy-intensive profit maximization. I hope you're all shocked, because I've cruelly summarised the literature to make a point. Indeed, there's much debate surrounding all these elements, and research since Rostow has highlighted the complexities and reversals of fortune involved in progressive linear narratives. But the dominant story, in my view, echoing Rostow, remains wedded to the nation-state as the appropriate unit of analysis, and with the metaphor of a race in which countries catch up or fall behind. In its less palatable forms, as we know, it's been coupled with a strong dose of European cultural and ethical superiority, as well as exceptionalism, expressed in bestsellers such as David Lande's Wealth and Poverty of Nations, and Niall Ferguson's 6 killer apps of Western civilization. Both go beyond any triumphalism to be found in Rostow. Deirdre McCloskey's explanation of economic development as the triumph of bourgeois virtues starting in the West, then diffusing to favoured places elsewhere, has asserted that if only the rest would cultivate and support an active entrepreneurial class and spirit, if Brazil and South Africa can be persuaded to adopt the liberal economic principles that are presently enriching China and India, there is no reason why in 40 years the grandchildren of presently poor Brazilians and South Africans cannot enjoy something pretty close to West European standards of living. McCloskey dismisses talk of environmental limits to modern industrial growth and potential convergence as pathological lapses from faith in liberal innovation. The key bourgeois virtue, alongside prudence and profit-making for McCloskey, is freedom, emanating from a polity that rolls back the state and promotes untrammeled market activities. Writing just before the 2008 crisis hit home, McCloskey held up the Celtic Tiger as the finest example of recent transformation, aided by a policy of banking liberalisation and tax relief for foreign direct investment. This was just before the Irish government went cap in hand for an EU IMF bailout and issued a free block of cheese to each household. Now, McCloskey might be seen as a charming outlier. It's probably how I see her, and she's a good friend of mine. But also, for Joel Mokyr, the most important Enlightenment innovation in Britain was free trade. Faith was placed in the free market. The mother of all institutional changes which needed to take place before economic growth was to become the norm rather than the exception. By the time of Queen Victoria's reign, ascent to the throne, it had become as much of a laissez-faire economy as can be expected on this earth, and rent-seeking in Britain was approaching extinction. Many of the neo-institutionalist works in the wake of Douglas North have further endorsed the liberal state market-led view of industrialisation by too often posing linear, progressive, liberal narratives against moribund, controlling and stagnant states. In a recent manifestation, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson have argued that whether nations fail or not depends on whether their political and economic institutions are inclusive and democratic or extractive and elitist. They have a particularly rosy view of the Glorious Revolution. Prior to 17th century England, extractive industries were the norm throughout history, but a broad coalition of Atlantic traders, industrialists, and commercially minded gentry created a pluralistic society at the end of the 17th century, making, and I haven't included this bit, the Bank of England a source of funds for industry. Although the literature is strong and growing, only a minority of historians attribute British precocity to mercantilism, war, protective tariffs, slavery, and regressive redistributive taxation. Few acknowledge the key role of the state, especially via the excise, in promoting manufacturing quality, measurement, record keeping, scientific advancement, and industrial output directly. In analysing comparative growth, only a minority of interpretations are concerned with exogenous forces that limit room to manoeuvre or encourage Dutch disease. The influence of Friedrich List advocating protectionism, import substitution and state-sponsored improvements in national market integration, banking and education are not as central in studies of global industrialisation as they should be. Yet these policies, not free competition, enabled other European nations to catch up with British levels of growth, just as did the USA via similar policies and tariffs as late as the mid-1920s. Such prescriptions also lay behind East Asia's successful post-war policies and, to a degree, behind those of the BRICS more recently. Rostow emphasised, as others have since, the role of interstate rivalry in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the importance of military spending and defence technology to growth. Gerschenkron recognised more completely, with reference to Europe and Russia, that the state could substitute for prerequisites in establishing the infrastructure and finance for takeoff. And Chalmers, Johnson and others developed the notion of proactive, growth-promoting developmental states, especially in East Asia, in contrast to the lighter touch regulatory regimes of the West. But in too much of the recent Anglophone growth literature for my liking, echoing Rostow, there is the expectation that former command economies and developmental states will eventually, inevitably, always come to grief because of the sclerotic nature of state long-term control compared with private enterprise. The currently popular interpretations of Western primacy, with their stress on free minds and free markets, appeal to a broad readership in the ideological climate of the last few decades. One might even suggest that Rostow's Cold War context has a contemporary parallel. The rise of China and the war on terror have created a climate in which we somehow need again to be reassured of the Western prescription, or at least an idealised liberal view of it. But today's environment is also significantly different from the 1960s. Asian growth has encouraged Anglophone research on its antecedents, which was virtually absent during the era of Western dominance. The development aid of the 1960s gave way to the Washington Consensus and structural adjustment programs of the 1980s. But as neither had the desired result, factors other than capital supply and free trade have come under the spotlight. The unequal rewards of global liberalisation are increasingly acknowledged. Encouraging primary producers to play only to their comparative advantage instead of developing a broader basis of growth led to the cul-de-sac of price volatility and diminishing returns. Despite the putative death of distance promoted by ICT and the lowering of international freight rates, inter-society wealth has polarised in recent decades. This demands rethinking about the assumption, even in the long term, of convergence, and has switched some attention to the importance of geography, endowments and market access. More maps, not chaps, and more latitudes, not attitudes. I'm sure it's not the first time most of you have heard that quip. There are thus promising signs for future analysis, but there remains a strong legacy from Rostow, mostly unacknowledged. It's seeped into our beings, and we should have ditched it more thoroughly long ago. I now want to turn to some of Rostow's pronouncements that we might do well to heed rather than ignore. In recent years, there's been an explosion of historical national accounting and its use in global growth analysis. But for Rostow, only a disaggregated or sectoral approach could reveal the links between new technologies, the growth process, and the importance of the state's role in development. It would have made my task much easier if I could have accepted GNP per capita as a legitimate measure of stages of growth and proceeded to associate that measure with changing structures and leading sectors, as Colin, Clark, Kuznets and Chenery have done. There are statistical associations to be made on that basis, but the averages that emerge with such statistical elegance are conceptually flawed. They are flawed because GNP per capita is determined by a number of variables which do not link to the degree to which technologies are absorbed in the economy. Economies come in various sizes with various population resource balances, and they have had various trade and capital flow relations to the international economy. Moreover, societies and their governments have made a wide variety of decisions about how much of their resources to allocate to military purposes. These variations affect both GNP per capita and the industrial structures that go with a given level of GNP per capita. Rostow had a long-running debate with Kuznets about this, but he was knocking at an open door because Kuznets himself was not in favour of using national accounts for studying development. He emphasised their cultural and historical specificity, that unrecorded activity lay outside their scope, that value judgments always entered calculations, and that lack of comparability of figures across time and space made it difficult to use national accounts for comparative analysis. But by the early 1950s, encouraged by the needs of international agencies, the system of national accounts and GDP per head were adopted by the UN and the OECD as standardised procedures and applied across countries and over time, used as the basis for growth analysis and for international decisions about poverty relief and aid. GDP does not measure a country's wealth or assets, technological or human capability, nor the stability or sustainability of growth. It does not measure economic development or human welfare. It merely attempts to capture growth in outputs and inputs. As Kuznets declared, it should not be used as an indicator of economic or social success. Historical national accounting has, of course, been a pillar of our subject for the last half-century, and it has given us an invaluable quantitative sense of macro parameters and comparative change over the long run. But estimates are necessarily based upon extrapolated partial evidence, and as with contemporary measures, historical accounting finds it difficult to allow for dispersed labour-intensive operations and for intangible goods and services, particularly where the latter are provided by the state or informally. Alongside Rostow, we should thus be wary about its use as a guide to the timing of significant structural changes, the proximate sources of growth, the level of technological innovation, and living standards. Cross-national, cross-cultural and cross-temporal figures are often compared, despite big differences in data and construction, as if they are measuring exactly the same thing. And when comparisons are made across wider spaces of culture and time, to China and Japan, India, Latin America, Africa, the results must be viewed warily in relation to one another. Those economic historians closest to assembling the national estimates are appropriately circumspect. The problem arises when published comparative figures reify results, trends, and turning points and fall without their footnotes into the hands of what some have termed the regression industry. The main difficulty is not necessarily inaccuracies of measurement, but the discrepancies and distortions are systematic rather than random. They are always likely to be much larger in less marketized and less regulated economies, and thus become highly significant in comparative work. Phyllis Dean encountered difficulties in her studies of Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia, but her comment could equally apply to any pre-industrial society. The problem of obtaining adequate data on the rural economies of Africa is the most serious obstacle in the way of framing satisfactory national income estimates for these territories. The accounting problem is not simply that of acute scarcity of the quantitative data, it's also a qualitative problem, which brings into question the fundamental validity for primitive communities of the social accounting concepts themselves. The entirely different conditions for gathering statistics created by tropical labour-intensive agriculture and weak central states results in GDP figures for Africa in particular, past and present, that are a long way from comparable with those for the West and North. Morton Jervin has suggested, for example, that the GDP for Tanzania in the 1990s is likely to be 3 times higher than estimated, and he's a specialist on the country. If such discrepancies and problems surround the estimation of less developed countries in recent decades, how much more difficult is it to be sure that the figures back to 1500 or earlier, sometimes to the Stone Age, for various parts of the globe can be seen as reliable for comparative statistical analysis. The categories and conventions of national accounts have also endorsed the way that the developed West thinks about the transition to modern economic growth, giving some economic activities more emphasis and value than others. GDP, by its very nature, as Jervin and Spike and others have argued, makes the US-European path look more valuable than other successful adaptations to different factor endowments and climatic conditions. Assumptions about a common path and expectations about the progressive direction of change also affect decisions about the choice of proxy figures and extrapolations. For transnational comparisons, purchasing power parities must be established, but these have even more intractable pitfalls than the GDP estimates themselves. They require internationally interchangeable consumer price indices to reflect the costs of living across entirely different agricultural, dietary, work, communal and climatic conditions. Pricing is necessarily based on evidence from marketed items, thus overestimating the poverty of all populations with a high subsistence element. This is a point made by Angus Deaton. It's little wonder that contemporary measures provoke debates, as for example when the 2005 official parity revision, occasioned by the addition of consumer price surveys for China and several other countries for the first time, created a further 500 million people worldwide living on the poverty line. The same revisions reduced China's GDP by 40%, India's by 36%, and cut more than 40% from the GDP figures for 5 other African and Asian nations. These are not insubstantial proportions. Unsurprisingly, since 1986, and all my economist colleagues will know this only too well, The Economist has opted to use global variation in the price of a Big Mac hamburger for parity, because Burgernomics is both easier and gives generally better or as good results. The problem of accounting for entirely new goods, qualitative changes in goods and services, and declining consumer goods prices also has implications for historical as well as current national accounting that remain a challenge for the future. William Nordhaus estimated that taking product innovations on board, between 1800 and 1992, the purchasing power of Americans had probably risen not by a conventionally measured factor of 13, but by factors ranging from 40 to 190. During Britain's Industrial Revolution, product innovations were legion, but they're not captured in the accounts. There were 115 patents for pressing, stamping and embossing metals, and a proliferation of design improvements and varieties in smallwares, glass, pottery, cutlery, as well as all forms of textiles and most consumer goods. My slide's just an example from my work on Welsh textiles. New and improved products and the associated price falls, and the growing availability of goods and services, the benefits of passenger speed on improved roads and railways, smallpox vaccination, municipal water and gas supplies, printing and the flush toilet, for example, should really be incorporated into historic growth measures. Table 1 shows the latest comparative figures for key countries and regions over the long term. For brevity, I must omit discussion of major distortions that might arise solely from the use of the 1990 international dollar for parity, a legacy from Angus Maddison, largely, that is hard, in my opinion, to justify. The figures take no account of income distribution, so to suggest, as has been done, but not by the authors, that these figures illustrate the absence of a Malthusian trap in early modern Northern Europe is a very bold step. The 1990 Caymish dollar would mean that you're looking for around $400 a year to get to what was in 1990 the poverty line, then defined as $1 a day. All right, these figures are above that level, but not to the safe margin that I would like to see if a statement is made from figures that have no income distribution attached to them. It's just one example of the readiness with which GDP figures are used beyond their ability to provide welfare information. Despite its leadership, Britain's per capita GDP growth, as we all know, throughout the 19th century remained slow. This has had a knock-on effect on Nick's painful calculations of slow productivity growth during industrialisation. Slow growth has been explained as the penalty of pioneering, the result of weakness in the incentive structures, or that cotton and iron floated in a sea of tradition. I myself argued some time ago that it was affected very much by the deindustrialisation that accompanied regional specialisation and concentration. These may all have had an impact, but slow growth of per capita GDP and productivity may also obtain simply because population was growing fast, the denominator, just as in King China, and GDP per capita is a poor estimate of what's going on in the economy. Real wages offer an alternative prospect for historical international comparison, but the difficulty of obtaining reliable comparable wage and price data are well known. The problem of reconciling different hours, work regimes, payment systems and recording practices across cultures are often aggravated again by Western norms that assume that a high degree of waged labour and monetised transactions apply in a wider area of the globe than they do. Consumption baskets that are comparable over time and space, spanning different dietary staples, forms of agriculture and cultures of eating, are also an intractable problem. Finding more meat, ale and processed foods should not prima facie be taken as indicating better nutrition or living standards. The content of baskets of goods shows different practices between countries rather than differences in development. Only 6% of attendees at this conference have elected for vegetarian catering, suggesting a meat bias in the discipline. It's not easy to compare the implications of meat in the diet across variations in the presence or absence of pastoral farming and across cultures that include those with taboos against meat consumption. The biggest potential pitfall for international comparison of real wages, however, is the choice of the silver standard as the best way to compare real purchasing power internationally. This assumes that the dual existence of silver as a commodity as well as a form of money and variations in the quality of silver or silver coins in different parts of the world will not distort results. It also assumes efficient local and transnational arbitrage and free global flows of bullion and coin unaffected by instability in demand supply, terms of trade, or cultural preference in the use of certain sorts of silver or coins. Monetary research has confirmed that a consistent silver standard did not obtain between different localities and regions of King China, let alone between China, India, Latin America, and the USA. As with comparative GDP, it's likely that the distortions introduced by using silver standard wages will be systematic rather than random. The grain wage appears to have been at a similar level in Western Europe and in China in 1500. Only when the silver standard is employed do results suggest such an early start to the Great Divergence. New global histories have gone well beyond Rostow's comparative conception in placing emphasis on the movement of peoples, ideas, animals, plants, commodities, and stressing similarities and connectivities as much as comparisons. It's ironic that this has occurred at the same time that development economics has focused upon endogenous models of change. The problem is that the two literatures rarely interact. Lack of dialogue is aggravated by different conceptions of what constitutes global history, illustrated in this rather dense slide. At one extreme, historians merely extend the geographical range of their studies. At the other, global history is used to invoke reciprocal comparisons and to question the universality of assumptions, measurement tools, and theories employed. Dialogue between different sorts of global historians is only forced when a gauntlet is thrown down, as with Pomerantz's book, The Great Divergence. The biggest reaction to Pomerantz arose from historians challenging his assertion that economic growth in the Yangtze Delta and living standards were comparable to Western Europe as late as the 18th century, and that Chinese institutions and commercial practices were reasonably well adapted to the needs of the economy. The reaction then was generally one of comparative history, applying Western yardsticks to refute Pomerantz' quantitative and qualitative pronouncements. But this did not address the main point of the book, which was that reciprocal comparison enabled one more clearly to see what was particularly distinctive about England, colonies and coal. A similar reaction occurred to Parthasarathy's work on wages and institutions in India. Looking at England in the Yangtze mirror, Pomerantz could see that endogenous processes brought Britain close to the precipice of disaster rather than to the verge of takeoff. Without coal and the dynamic of the Atlantic economy, Western Europe could easily have stagnated or been forced along a more labour-intensive, resource-saving path. This chimes with Tony Wrigley's suggestion that we should not ask why and when the Industrial Revolution started, but why it didn't stop in England in particular, and why it became, in Rostow's original terms, self-sustaining. The view that the British economy came close to crisis until rescued by coal and imperial trading has recently found support in the energy accounting and nutritional evidence. This lines up with Robert Fogle's thesis: British agriculture could not support the population without food imports for 100 years following about the 1770s. And imports were insufficient until the food reserves of the empire and other parts were opened up by railways, ocean shipping and refrigeration. Until that point, there was no food security for the bottom 40% of the population. The lowest decile had under 2,000 calories PCU per day for 2 centuries, and a further 30% hovered around or below the 3,000 calories necessary for working effectively and maintaining health. It's a small example of Charles Feinstein's pessimism perpetuated. An important one. The energy accounting evidence does not fit with the idea that the Malthusian threat in England had been banished 2 or more centuries earlier. The importance of unrecorded self-provisioning and the informal economy in keeping famine at bay seems obvious from this diagram, but this part of the economy does not show up in growth measures. Whilst Western analysis of Asia, following Rostow, had seen Japan, India and China very much through the European mirror, the work of Pomerantz, Bin Wong, Gareth Austin and others, by highlighting adaptations to different ecological as well as social and political environments, have made it clearer to see the ecological specificities of the European and North American, as well as the Asian and African experience. And within Asian scholarship, a major challenge has been developed to interpretations that assume that Western precocity resulted from finding the optimal route to long-term economic development. The notion of an industrious revolution was first conceptualized in the 1970s as a description of Japanese industrialization in contrast to the industrial revolutions in the West. This comparison, which included a key role for rural industrialization in by-employments, has since been refined into the conception of a labour rather than capital-intensive path to and through industrialisation, one based initially upon family production units and vigorous Smithian growth, occurring without Western-style property rights or developed factor markets, without proletarianisation, and without significant foreign trade. The pre-industrial Western path, given temperate cropping limitations, sought to increase labour productivity in agriculture by extending the land under cultivation and adopting more animal husbandry. East Asia held a far larger population with a relatively small amount of land and little pasture based upon intensive forms of rice cultivation with double cropping and growing industriousness. Industrialization in Meiji Japan further pursued the labour-intensive path. Western technology was selectively adopted and adapted in ways appropriate to Japanese conditions. Capital was substituted for labour to a degree, but industrialization remained labour-intensive, a different pattern to the West. Culture, ideology and consumption patterns contributed to the persistence of the path. The same sort of labour intensity was followed by China in the interwar period and by several other East and Southeast Asian countries after World War II. Today, most global manufacturing is sited where factor endowments are similar to the East Asian path, with an abundance of labour relative to capital. As Kaoru Sugihara, who is responsible for developing this idea to a large degree, has argued, East Asia would not have industrialised without Western influence, but it was the East Asian path of economic development that made it possible for the majority of the world's population to benefit from global industrialisation. If it was the replacement of labour by capital that started the process of global industrialisation, it was the labour-intensive path that diffused industrialisation among poor countries, contributing to the reduction of global income inequality. He also suggests that a labour-intensive path that is less environmentally damaging and more sustainable than the capital, resource and energy-intensive route may provide an important lesson for the global energy-saving future. Sugihara's conception suggests that global industrialisation occurred as a fusion of the two paths, but that only by rebalancing development towards labour and skill intensity, coupled with energy saving, might further reductions in global inequality be achieved. The idea of two or more paths to industrialisation goes well beyond Rostow or Gerschenkron's backwardness ideas, which were wedded to the notion of a single path. Indeed, Gerschenkron, on the basis of East European and Russian experience, emphasised that later industrialisers would tend to adopt more rather than less capital-intensive technologies. In the wake of Japanese revisionism, new ways of looking at the impact of relative and changing factor endowments in Africa and Latin America are in train, and I think this is some of the most interesting and important work on global industrialisation at the moment. This suggests a future historiography of varied global narratives, allowing for the advantages and disadvantages of different factor combinations and paths to change in response to shifts in global demand and in relation to changing energy, environmental and demographic variables, the latter being very important. The family economy, industriousness and the social capacity to hold a substantial population on land with limited resources are much highlighted in the Asian path, as I've discussed. But such topics have been sidelined in studies of economic growth in the West. When they have become central, such as with debates over proto-industrialisation and European industrious revolution, family economies and labour-intensive production have been studied less as an end in themselves than as a stepping stone to industrialisation proper or to an acquisitive consumer society. The Western path had a dual nature before takeoff and retained it long after, even until today, but this is not much studied and it is not adequately reflected in conventional growth measures. It was gradually less important as the industrialised economy advanced, but decline was slowed and complicated by repeated periods of resurgence of labour intensity and dispersed specialisation. Western paths had an enduring labour-intensive resource-saving path that we have insufficiently measured, valued or explored. No one studying West Yorkshire, Britain's most advanced industrialising region in the 18th century, or indeed Lancashire, could avoid this conclusion. In both counties, labour intensity, rather than capital intensity, laid the foundation and provided the continuing force behind the knowledge base and external economies of regional sectoral specialisation and concentration. Labour-intensive, skill-intensive trades were perhaps the most vital of all for sustaining inventiveness, notably clock and watchmaking in South Lancashire, which used little capital or fuel throughout the 19th century. Persistence and endorsement of regional concentration of textile manufacturing in England in the mid and later 19th century was based upon the sunk costs and the agglomeration effects of the water power industrious labour-intensive path. Only this explains why, by the later 19th century, 40% of world output of cotton goods was produced within 30 miles of Manchester. From large factories, yes, but also from thousands of dispersed workshops, and even from many domestic premises. The industrial conurbations of Birmingham and the back country were dominated by dispersed small-scale enterprise, suited to bespoke and low-quality production alike. In most European industrial regions, the growth of factories and heavy industries was preceded and accompanied by the proliferation of labour and skill-intensive family-based manufacturing and services, which also underpinned the gradual improvement of living standards. Morgan Kelly, Joel Mokia and Cormac O'Grada have kindly lent me some maps. They've recently surveyed England by county, looking at the relationship between growth factors and the structural shift toward industrial employments between 1760 and 1830. This confirms what historians of the industrialising North have long been saying. Against the view that high wages and cheap coal drove industrialisation, they find that proximity to coal had no impact and that industrialisation was restricted to low-wage areas. Wages began gradually to rise in Lancashire and Yorkshire and in the North East in the 19th century as a result of industrialisation, not its cause. The rapidly industrialising counties had other characteristics too. They already had a high density of population relative to workable land, map 3, and a much larger proportion of the land was held in small family-run farms, 10 acres or less, map 2. They had extensive proto-industrial activity carried on alongside farming, and a reservoir of indigenous human capability and manufacturing skills learned largely in the home, and only partly reflected in the literacy rates in map 6. Dispersed rural manufacturing households provided work for a range of household members, raising household incomes. Rural by-employments also gave the population better access to self-provisioning. Thus, they had better nutrition than elsewhere, based upon oats and milk rather than meat, I should add, at a time when real wages and nutrition nationally were being severely squeezed. Maps 4 and 5. It's instructive, I think, to see industrialising England in the East Asian mirror. The map data do not include Wales, but it would be impossible to describe the Industrial Revolution in South Wales without considering the dual path to growth. Despite its heavy industry bias, there remained an array of labour-intensive, small farming, textile manufacturing and workshop units throughout South Wales that in good part fed, clothed and housed the growing industrial populations, as well as contributing significantly to the manufacturing base itself. And since the decline of the old staples, it is the dispersed labour-intensive sector that has rescued the South Wales economy. A stone's throw from my home in West Wales is a dairy farm under pressure from the current milk crisis. So the family now recycle electrical equipment alongside milking. The sons sort and parcel up old computers and mobile phones for export. The grandmother sits in the kitchen stripping out the copper from cabling, putting the array of spoils into a set of large buckets. The proactive labour-intensive route is still with us and in many guises. I believe that in India there's a bicycle-powered cable stripping machine in common household use, but this has not yet hit West Wales as far as I am aware. Western historiography has not pondered hard enough about the ubiquity and the virtues of the labour-absorbing route in the West, in providing skilled employment, distributed and low-impact living. It has had some examination within the concept of high-end flexible specialisation, but it remains too often regarded as either a stepping stone to the optimal capital-intensive path or only negatively as a route to involution and sweating. To wind up, at the precious age, or precocious age I have written here actually, of 20, in 1936, Rostow came to Balliol on a Rhodes Scholarship, one of the first Americans to do so. After some months, he was invited to spend a weekend in the country with Mounier Poston and Eileen Power. They picked him up in a small car and headed out into rural Oxfordshire. But after driving around in circles for an hour or two, they were unable to find their cottage. Now, Rostow was a man with a linear mission and found this eccentric European approach almost impossible to understand. Rostow was wrong about a lot of things: universal stages, common goals of modernisation, sharp transitions, high capital investment rates, the dynamics of change. So we need to see the world much less like Rostow saw it. But we might also heed Rostow's advice to study sectors and regions more than national aggregates, particularly for comparative global research. Beyond Rostow, we must integrate long-term factors of biosphere, endowments, geography, locale, people and families, informal as well as the formal economy into our studies. And we need to encourage the analysis of goals of development other than growth, with equality much higher on the list, as Tawney would have wished. Thank you.